So the first few videos I'm going to upload to this channel are going to be discussions of Linux and open source software and whether or not you should adopt Linux as your OS of choice. This series will be called Discovering Linux. My name is Michael Kornblum. I'm an independent web developer, writer, and volunteer instructor. Recently, I started a new channel called The Linux Lifestyle, which is going to be a discussion of free and open source software for the average user. Now, in part one, we are going to discuss what exactly Linux is, namely the kernel, as well as Linux distributions. So, what exactly is Linux? Well, in short, it's the name of a software kernel developed by Linus Torvalds in the early 1990s while he was still a student at the University of Helsinki, Finland. But what exactly is a kernel? Well, a kernel is a piece of software that connects computer hardware to the rest of an operating system. It is one of the first pieces of software that is booted up when you power on your system, and anything that uses an operating system needs that kernel in order to effectively function. Now, kernels are not unique to the Linux ecosystem. If you look here, we have various examples of operating systems and the kernels that are used in them. For example, in the Windows ecosystem, we have NT OS Kernel.exe. If you're using Mac OS or an iOS device, you're probably using the XNU kernel. And if you're using an Android device, congratulations, you're already using Linux. Now, the kernel is not the sum total of an operating system. Okay? In the world of Linux, things that are bundled up with the kernel are often referred to as Linux distributions. Now, what exactly can be found in a Linux distribution? First off, you have kernel modules. These are essentially the device drivers that allow the hardware to run. They usually come bundled, actually compiled with the source code from the Linux kernel for a specific hardware you intend to use and system architectures. For example, you may see a Linux distro that's specifically made for the new ARM chipsets, such as those found on the Pinebook 64 or the Raspberry Pi. Or you may find Linux distributions that have kernel modules that are specifically made for 64-bit processors or even 32-bit processors. Next, we have the shell. The shell serves as a sort of interface for the Linux kernel. It's basically that one spot between the application layer and the kernel itself. Commands are basically input through the shell using either a command line interface or a graphical application, like those found in most modern operating systems. Next, we have desktop environments. Desktop environments are basically the graphic user interfaces that are similar to those present in most modern operating systems. The most popular desktop environments you will find in Linux are the GNOME desktop, then you have KDE Plasma, and XFCE, and Mate, and Cinnamon, just to name a few. Next, we have applications. Lots and lots of applications. Let's look at a few categories that we may run across when we work with Linux distribution. The first one would be command line applications. These are the ones that run in a terminal emulator, basically via typed commands. Those of us who have worked with Unix-based operating systems, either as system administrators or developers, or even those who remember the good old days of DOS, remember typing in commands to run applications. And this is exactly what we're looking at right here. Next, we have desktop applications. These are the applications that are unique to specific desktop environments. For example, if you are looking for a file explorer on the GNOME desktop, it is often named Nautilus. Whereas with KDE Plasma, the file explorer will be named Dolphin, or with XFCE, you'll probably be looking for the Thunar file manager. Next, we have distro-specific applications. For example, if you are running a distribution that is made for multimedia production, you may find that it has a lot of applications geared towards graphic editing, video editing, audio production. Whereas if you are looking for a distro for gaming, you may find one that has a popular app marketplace like Steam, or a way of running Windows games on a Linux-based hardware, such as Lutris or Play on Linux, or, you may find various tools to optimize your system's hardware to play the more, resource-intensive games. Next, we have user applications. These are the applications that are basically installed, updated, and deleted through the use of dedicated package managers. For example, apt and Ubuntu-based systems, or Pacman and Arch-based systems. These applications can usually be acquired via an online resource that is called a repository, which is very similar to the software stores you would see on iOS, Android, Windows, or Mac operating systems. Now, before we run off, I'm going to show you a few examples of Linux distributions and give a brief description. The first example distribution will be Ubuntu. This is Ubuntu version 2004 LTS. This desktop operating system receives system updates for 5 years. There's not going to be a lot of changes in this operating system because its focus is geared towards stability and an enterprise market. Next, we have Manjaro. Manjaro sports a different desktop environment than the one we saw in Ubuntu. With Ubuntu, we saw the GNOME desktop. Here we have KDE Plasma. Unlike Ubuntu, basically, Manjaro features some newer packages and uses a semi-rolling release model where newer packages go through a short vetting process and then are added to the Manjaro repository, making for a system that runs slightly newer software. Next, we have Linux Mint. Okay, Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu, but is more geared towards beginners. Is touted for its user friendliness and general user experience. Unlike Ubuntu, which uses GNOME, or Manjaro, which uses KDE Plasma, this uses its own in-house desktop environment, which is called Cinnamon. Now, this was just a few Linux distributions. And quite literally, how many are there? Well, thousands. Many Linux distributions mostly consist of free and open source software, which means that you can download, in many cases, a Linux distribution, add things you like into it, remove things you don't, mix and match, and then re-release the product, to others to, share, use, and enjoy. This software model is commonly referred to as free and open source software. And in our next video, we're going to look at free and open source software in depth, what it is, and how it affects the Linux ecosystem in general. But in the interim, this is Michael Kornblum. I would like to thank you for sticking around throughout the duration of this video. I hope you like, share, subscribe to this channel, and ring the bell. And I'm hoping that you stay safe, stay well, stay awesome, and be great to one another. Have a good night.